Case number 1 is that of Lorenzo Jerome Gilliard Jr. The story of Lorenzo takes us where between 1977 and 1993, the local peace was shattered by an act so calculated and brutal it defied explanation. It started with a series of 13 women found strangled and discarded in alleys and parking lots across the city. Now, you have to understand, the initial scene didn't give the investigators much to work with as leads faded and scenes were often contaminated. But as they began to dig decades later, the reality of what Lorenzo had done started to surface. The investigation was a masterclass in the power of cold case DNA forensics. Detectives spent weeks re-examining biological samples and placing the suspect under surveillance to confirm his identity. Imagine the pressure they were under as they tracked Lorenzo's movements to his daily routine, which even included monitoring him at a local Denny's restaurant. The breakthrough finally came when a 2004 federal cold case DNA initiative linked semen evidence from the victims to a blood sample he had provided in 1987 linked Lorenzo directly to the crime. It's one of those cases where you realize that no matter how much someone tries to cover their tracks, there's always a breadcrumb left behind. Once the arrest was made, the case moved into the courtroom, and the proceedings were decisive yet somber. The prosecution's strategy was centered on matching his DNA profile to 6 of the victims and demonstrating how his trash disposal job routes overlapped with the body dump sites. On the other side, the defense tried to push the narrative of denial, but the overwhelming forensic evidence made their arguments difficult to sustain. Ultimately, the jury saw right through it. Lorenzo was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge's final remarks really drove home the gravity of the situation. Looking back at the case of Lorenzo Jerome Gilliard Jr., there are 3 brief lessons to remember. First, serial killers can hide in plain sight, often protected by the mask of a normal, disciplined life. Second, forensic science has the power to restore the truth even when decades have erased human memory. And finally, justice, even when delayed for over 30 years, can still reclaim forgotten lives from the silence. Case number 2 is that of Lindsay Jones and Victor Sykes. The story of Jones and Sykes takes us to the Oak Park neighborhood, where on October 17, 2019, the local peace was shattered by an act so cold-blooded it defied explanation. It started with a triple homicide following a drug-related argument where 3 people were gunned down in broad daylight. Now, you have to understand, the initial scene was chaotic, but as they began to dig, the reality of what Jones and Sykes had done started to surface. The investigation was a masterclass in rapid response and tactical coordination. Detectives spent weeks reconstructing the timeline of the argument and the suspect's movements. Imagine the pressure they were under as they tracked the suspect's movements to a black sedan, fleeing the vicinity of the crime. The breakthrough finally came when patrol officers stopped the vehicle within blocks of the scene and discovered the murder weapon inside, which linked Jones and Sykes directly to the crime. It's one of those cases where you realize that no matter how much someone tries to cover their tracks, there's always a breadcrumb left behind. Once the arrest was made, the case moved into the courtroom, and the proceedings were emotionally charged. The prosecution's strategy was centered on the immediate recovery of the firearm and the testimony regarding the heated dispute that preceded the shooting. On the other side, the defense tried to push the narrative of conflicting witness accounts, but the jury saw right through it. Jones and Sykes were found guilty of multiple counts of first-degree murder and received a sentence of 3 consecutive life terms plus 30 years for Jones, while Sykes received 327 years. The judge's final remarks really drove home the gravity of the situation. Looking back at the case of Lindsay Jones and Victor Sykes, there are 3 brief lessons to remember. First, disputes over trivial matters can escalate into permanent tragedy when illegal firearms are involved. Second, the speed of a police response can be the difference between a cold case and immediate justice. And finally, the consequences of violent choices are far-reaching, destroying not just the victims' families but the lives of the perpetrators as well. Case number 3 is that of Ahmaud R. Herring. The story of Ahmaud takes us to the area near 56th and Elmwood, where on May 11, 2021, the local peace was shattered by an act so heinous it defied explanation. It started with a missing person report for 52-year-old Gilberto Gutierrez, whose family became alarmed after finding his bloody clothing. Point 1 Now, you have to understand, the initial scene didn't give the investigators much to work with, but as they began to dig, the reality of what Ahmad had done started to surface. The investigation was a masterclass in combining digital forensics with traditional evidence collection. Detectives spent weeks combing through surveillance footage of a white Dodge Charger and analyzing cell phone logs used to make ransom demands. Point 2 Imagine the pressure they were under as they tracked Ahmad's movements to local stores where he purchased bleach, ammonia, and drop cloths just days after the disappearance. Point 3 The breakthrough finally came when DNA evidence found on a zip tie near the victim's body linked Ahmad directly to the crime. It's one of those cases where you realize that no matter how much someone tries to cover their tracks, there's always a breadcrumb left behind. Once the arrest was made, the case moved into the courtroom, and the proceedings were emotionally charged. The prosecution's strategy was centered on the overwhelming physical evidence, including the cleaning supply receipts and the DNA match. Point 4 On the other side, the defense tried to push the narrative of inconsistent witness testimony, but the jury saw right through it. Ahmad was found guilty of second-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, first-degree robbery, and 2 counts of armed criminal action, and received a sentence of 46 years in prison. Point 5 The judge's final remarks really drove home the gravity of the situation. Looking back at the case of Ahmad R. Herring, there are 3 brief lessons to remember. First, digital footprints and financial transactions are nearly impossible to erase in a modern investigation. Second, the persistence of a family in reporting a loved one missing can be the catalyst for uncovering a dark truth. And finally, even the most meticulous attempts to clean a crime scene can be undone by a single piece of biological evidence. Case number 4 is that of Gary Dion Davis. The story of Gary takes us to the area of Lafayette Avenue and Sewell Avenue, where between 1996 and 1998, the local peace was shattered by acts so gruesome they defied explanation. It started with the discovery of the bodies of 2 women, Pearl Davis and Christina King, found in abandoned buildings and vacant houses. Now, you have to understand, the initial scene didn't give the investigators much to work with, and the cases grew cold for nearly 3 decades. But as they began to dig again, the reality of what Gary had done started to surface. The investigation was a masterclass in the evolution of DNA technology and cold case persistence. Detectives spent weeks reanalyzing biological evidence from the 1990s and comparing it to modern databases. Imagine the pressure they were under as they tracked Gary's movements to his life as a long-haul truck driver, a job that allowed him to move across the country undetected for years. The breakthrough finally came when a newly formed cold case unit matched DNA from both crime scenes directly to Gary's known profile in 2022. It's one of those cases where you realize that no matter how much someone tries to cover their tracks, there's always a breadcrumb left behind. Once the arrest was made, the case moved into the courtroom, and the proceedings were unusually long-awaited. The prosecution's strategy was centered on the forensic link between the suspect and the brutal scenes where the victims were stabbed and beaten. On the other side, the defense tried to push the narrative of not guilty for both counts, successfully arguing for an acquittal in one of the cases. Ultimately, the jury saw the truth in the other. Gary was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Pearl Davis and received a sentence that is scheduled to be finalized in February 2026, following his conviction in January. The judge's final remarks really drove home the gravity of the situation. Looking back at the case of Gary Dion Davis, there are 3 brief lessons to remember. First, time does not erase the evidence left at a crime scene. It only waits for technology to catch up. Second, those who commit such acts often attempt to hide in plain sight, living seemingly ordinary lives while carrying dark secrets. And finally, a dedicated cold case unit can provide a voice for victims who have been silenced for decades. 5 is that of Errol Dawkins. The story of Errol takes us to the neighborhood of Scarrett Point, where on August 6, 2025, the local peace was shattered by an act so premeditated and cruel it defied explanation. It started with the shocking murder of a 22-year-old pregnant teacher, Brazen Kane, who was gunned down in her own front yard. Now, you have to understand, The initial scene was devastating for the community, but as they began to dig, the reality of what Errol had done started to surface. Investigators quickly learned that this wasn't a random act of violence. It was the culmination of a terrifying pattern of behavior that had been escalating for some time. The investigation was a masterclass in digital tracking and behavioral analysis. Detectives spent weeks meticulously combing through cell phone pings and private security camera feeds from the surrounding streets. Imagine the pressure they were under as they tracked Errol's movements to the exact locations where he had been following the victim in the days leading up to the attack. The breakthrough finally came when surveillance footage captured his vehicle at the scene and digital evidence confirmed he had been stalking her every move, which linked Errol directly to the crime. It's one of those cases where you realize that no matter how much someone tries to cover their tracks, there's always a breadcrumb left behind. Once the arrest was made, the case moved into the courtroom, and the proceedings were extremely heavy and emotionally charged. The prosecution's strategy was centered on proving the element of premeditation through the digital stalking logs and the targeted nature of the shooting. On the other side, the defense tried to push the narrative of an impulsive act or lack of intent, but the physical and digital evidence was overwhelming. Ultimately, the gravity of the crime, taking the life of a young educator and her unborn child, was undeniable. Errol was found guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action and received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's final remarks really drove home the gravity of the situation. Looking back at the case of Errol Dawkins, there are 3 brief lessons to remember. First, stalking is a critical red flag that must be treated with the utmost urgency by law enforcement. Second, our digital footprints are constant witnesses to our actions, providing clarity when human testimony is absent. And finally, the loss of a teacher is a wound to the entire community, highlighting the ripple effect of a single violent act. Number 6 is that of Curtail Hudson. The story of Curtail takes us to the area of Northeast 9th and Michigan, where on August 1, 2018, the local peace was shattered by an act so senseless and random it defied explanation. It started with a midday shooting spree that targeted a group of individuals near a local church, resulting in the death of a 24-year-old Chinese missionary named Zindong Hao. Now, you have to understand, the initial scene was one of pure terror as civilians ran for cover from a man wielding a shotgun. But as they began to dig, the reality of what Curtail had done started to surface. The investigation was a masterclass in swift community cooperation and old-school detective work. Detectives spent weeks interviewing shaken witnesses and scouring the neighborhood for the discarded weapon. Imagine the pressure they were under as they tracked Curtail's movements to a nearby storm drain where he had attempted to hide the evidence. The breakthrough finally came when witnesses identified him as the shooter and pointed police toward the drain where the shotgun was recovered, which linked Curtail directly to the crime. It's one of those cases where you realize that no matter how much someone tries to cover their tracks, there's always a breadcrumb left behind. Once the arrest was made, the case moved into the courtroom, and the proceedings were chilling as the motive came to light. The prosecution's strategy was centered on the random nature of the attack and the recovery of the weapon used to kill a man who was simply trying to spread a message of peace. On the other side, the defense tried to push the narrative of drug-induced psychosis, claiming that Curtail was under the influence of PCP-laced marijuana at the time of the shooting. Ultimately, the jury saw right through the attempt to deflect responsibility. Curtail was found guilty of second-degree murder and armed criminal action and received a sentence of 26 years in prison. The judge's final remarks really drove home the gravity of the situation. Looking back at the case of Curtail Hudson, there are 3 brief lessons to remember. First, substance abuse can turn a person into a lethal threat to completely innocent strangers. Second, community members who step forward as witnesses are the backbone of a successful investigation. And finally, the life of a missionary lost in service reminds us of the profound tragedy that occurs when violence meets a path of peace. Case number 7 is that of Aaron K. Wynn. The story of Aaron takes us to a residence on Tracy Avenue, where on October 13, 2022, the local peace was shattered by an act so absurd yet lethal it defied explanation. It started with a heated domestic dispute between two brothers that rapidly escalated from a verbal argument into a deadly physical confrontation. Now, you have to understand, the initial scene inside the home was a portrait of domestic chaos, but as they began to dig, the reality of what Aaron had done started to surface. The catalyst for the violence was something as trivial as a burnt pizza, a mundane household frustration that turned into a bloodbath. The investigation was a masterclass in utilizing social media as a real-time digital confession. Detectives spent weeks securing and analyzing video footage that the suspect himself had provided. I mean, imagine the pressure they were under as they tracked Aaron's movements to his own Facebook Live broadcast, where he had been filming the argument with his brother, Stephen, just moments before the killing. The breakthrough finally came when the live-streamed video showed Aaron wielding a 30-inch samurai sword and making direct threats, which linked Aaron directly to the crime. It's one of those cases where you realize that no matter how much someone tries to cover their tracks, there's always a breadcrumb left behind. And in this case, the breadcrumb was a digital broadcast. Once the arrest was made, the case moved into the courtroom, and the proceedings were chillingly straightforward. The prosecution's strategy was centered on the defendant's own video evidence, which captured him brandishing the sword and lunging at his brother while the victim pleaded for him to stop. On the other side, the defense tried to push the narrative of self-defense or a lack of intent to kill, but the jury saw right through it. The recorded evidence clearly showed the aggressor's mindset. Aaron was found guilty of second-degree murder and armed criminal action and received a sentence of 18 years in prison. The judge's final remarks really drove home the gravity of the situation. Looking back at the case of Aaron K. Wynn, there are 3 brief lessons to remember. First, even the most minor domestic disagreements can turn fatal when weapons are within reach. Second, the impulse to broadcast one's life on social media can often capture the very evidence needed for a conviction. And finally, the tragedy of fratricide leaves a family twice broken, losing both the victim and the perpetrator to a single moment of rage. Case number 8 is that of Dion Benson. The story of Dion takes us to the busy stretch of I-70 near downtown, where in October 2022, the local peace was shattered by an act so reckless and terrifying it defied explanation. It started with a series of reports of a highway shooting that left a young mother, Ketta Glenn, dead in her vehicle while her children were present. Now, you have to understand, the initial scene was a nightmare for commuters and investigators alike, but as they began to dig, the reality of what Dion had done started to surface. This wasn't just a single incident of road rage. It was a glimpse into a much darker, repetitive cycle of violence. The investigation was a masterclass in ballistic matching and psychological profiling. Detectives spent weeks recovering shell casings from the highway and connecting them to a specific firearm associated with several other shooting reports. I mean, imagine the pressure they were under as they tracked Dion's movements to a vehicle that matched witness descriptions of a silver sedan seen weaving through traffic before the shots were fired. The breakthrough finally came when Dion was brought in for questioning and gave a shocking interrogation room confession, admitting to the shooting and chillingly claiming he had shot around 400 people in his life, which linked Dion directly to the crime. It's one of those cases where you realize that no matter how much someone tries to cover their tracks, there's always a breadcrumb left behind. Once the arrest was made, the case moved into the courtroom, and the proceedings were extremely high stakes given the suspect's age and the nature of his admissions. The prosecution's strategy was centered on the ballistics evidence and the defendant's own taped statements where he showed little remorse for the life taken. On the other side, the defense tried to push the narrative of youthful bravado or psychological instability, arguing that his 400 victims claim was an exaggeration rather than a fact. Ultimately, the court decided the risk to the public was too high. Dion was charged as an adult with first-degree murder and multiple counts of armed criminal action. As of early 2026, he is awaiting the finality of his sentence. The judge's remarks during the certification hearing really drove home the gravity of the situation. Looking back at the case of Dion Benson, there are 3 brief lessons to remember. First, road rage can escalate into a capital crime in a matter of seconds, leaving families shattered on a public thoroughfare. Second, the ego of a perpetrator often leads them to boast about crimes that police might otherwise struggle to prove. And finally, modern ballistics and surveillance can turn a chaotic highway shooting into a closed case through meticulous forensic mapping.